right, here we're going to walk through our next little section of notes, and we're going to be multiplying and dividing our fractions this time. So let's just double check our learning targets for today. So last time we looked at the parts of a fraction, and we added and subtracted those fractions. So today we're going to learn about multiplying and dividing fractions. So where we ended last time was with this page right here with adding and subtracting fractions. So on the next page, we're going to be multiplying those fractions. Okay? And the piece of paper that you need looks something like this. And we're going to cut along each of these lines and kind of dig in a little bit. So first let's look at when I'm multiplying a fraction by a fraction, what that looks like. So we're going to look at both just the steps that we take and also what it looks like visually, what we're actually doing and why it works that way. So the first step when we're multiplying fractions is we multiply the numerators together. So our example here is we have 2/5 times 3/4. So step one is I multiply those numerators, and that's in the pink, and I end up with 6. Step number 2 is I multiply my denominators. So when we added or subtracted, we had to go in and find those common denominators. We don't have to do that step if we're multiplying, or as we'll see when we're dividing. But we just go ahead and multiply those denominators. So for this example, we have 5 times 4, and that's 20. Our third and final step is to simplify. We always want to get our fractions down as simple as we can. So I notice that both of these values are even and can be divided by 2. So I go ahead and I divide them both by 2, and I end up with 3/10. So let's see what that actually looks like in a picture. Okay, so here you see I've got my 2 holes. My first one is 2/5. So I cut my hole into 5 equal pieces, and 2 of them are shaded. And I'm multiplying that times 3/4. So this piece is cut into 4ths, and 3 of them are shaded. So when I multiply them, it's like I'm sliding these 2 pieces on top of each other, and I'm combining them there. So this is what it would look like. My 3/4 is still shaded in blue, and my 2/5 is still shaded in red. And we see that there's some overlap right here that turns purple in 6 out of 20 of these sections. And that's exactly the answer we got back here, and we just looked at the numbers. So this is just our visual representation of what we're actually doing and why we can just go ahead and multiply the numerators, and this is why we also multiply the denominators, is because when we combine these 2 pieces and we slide them together, we end up with 20 different little pieces. Okay, so that's if I have a fraction times a fraction. So what if I have a fraction times a whole number? So my first step is I rewrite the whole number as a fraction. And I know that since I'm not cutting it into pieces, the first step is going to be to put that over 1, because each of those chunks is cut into 1 piece, and I have 5 of them. So that's how I can get my fraction. So any whole number is just that number over 1. So that's step 1, is rewriting that as a fraction. And then step 2, I'm going to go back up to multiplying these fractions by fractions. So I multiply the numerators, and then I multiply the denominators. And then, of course, I simplify. So for this example, 5/4, there's no value that can go into both of these evenly to simplify my fraction, so I leave it there. So let's look at what this actually looks like. So if I have 1/4 times 5, that tells me here's 1/4, right? Because this one is cut into 4 equal pieces, and 1 of them is shaded. And this is how many of them I have. So I have 5 of these. So then if I go ahead and add these things together, right, that's what multiplication is repeated addition. So I add and I add and I add and I add and I add 5 different times, I end up with 5/4. So we can look at that in a picture as well as just the numbers. So now let's look at if we're dealing with a fraction and a mixed number. Okay, so step 1 is we're going to convert that mixed number to an improper fraction, right? And we talked about how we can do that in the steps to do that as well. So the first thing we do is do that. So I would take 5 times 2 plus 1, which gives me 11/5. So now that I have 2 fractions again, I go ahead and I multiply. I multiply across the numerator, and I multiply across the denominator, and then I can simplify. So I notice I can't simplify this improper fraction. There's nothing that I can multiply, or I can divide into the numerator and denominator evenly, so I can leave it there. Sometimes you'll need to convert back to a mixed number, and if that's the case, we can follow those steps. So 10 goes into 33 3 times, and there are 3 left over, and my denominator stays the same. Okay, so now we've looked at some different scenarios of multiplying. So now I want you to go ahead and practice. So on your next page, you're going to give me a couple of examples. And now these are the 2 problems that I've actually handed you. So give yourself some space, because I want to see not only the mathematical working of this, but I want you to draw the pictures of what it would look like when we were multiplying these together, right? So kind of like the examples I gave you back in your notes. So here we've got a picture example here, and we've got a picture example here. What are these two examples going to look like? Okay, so there's multiplying some fractions. So now let's look at dividing fractions. So we're going to walk through a couple of examples together. So we're really going to be looking at models again and what it actually looks like. Because we get so caught in the like, what's the step I do? We need to know why we're doing it and what it actually looks like. So here's our first kind of example. We're going to be dividing a fraction by a whole number. Okay, so Jada had 1/4 of her birthday cake left. She and her mom and dad split it evenly. How much of the cake will each person get? So you see that I've underlined the how much of the cake will each person get, because that's our kind of final question we're answering. So first we want to come up with our equation, right? So here we have 1/4. She had 1/4 of her birthday cake left, and they were going to split it evenly. There were 3 of them. So now what can we do there? So here I see I have one whole cake, and I have 1/4 of it left. So that's where these kind of vertical lines come in. So I had 1/4 of my cake left. Well, then I divided that into thirds, right? Because each of those people get an even piece. So then I see I have a total of 12 pieces in here, and one of them is what each single person gets. Okay? So that's kind of what this little model is looking at. It says I have one cake to start with, I have 1/4 left, and then I divide that by 3, so I end up with 1/12 total. Okay? So then let's looking at dividing a whole number by a fraction. Okay, so we divided a fraction by a whole number, now we're going the other direction. Okay, so Layla had 3 cakes. She would give each of her friends 1/4 of a cake. How many friends would she be able to give cake? So she started with 3 cakes, and each of those cakes is divided into fourths. So then there are 12 total pieces of cake. So my equation would be 3 divided by 1/4 equals 12. And so we can just see kind of how we can deal with this with pictures as well as just looking at the fractions. So one thing you'll see is we don't usually tend to divide by fractions, is we tend to kind of take our fraction and flip it and multiply, and that's really kind of what we do as well. So now let's look at like just mathematically what we do here. Okay, so you'll have a sheet of paper that looks kind of, let me get it so I can see the whole thing, that looks like this. So we're going to look at these 3 different steps. Okay, and so down at the bottom you'll see we're looking at a fraction divided by a fraction, a whole number divided by a fraction, and a fraction divided by a whole number. Okay, and I use different colors in these just because that's how my brain likes to focus. So I'm going to cover this part up so we can stay kind of focused on what we're looking at here. So step 1, no matter what we have, we convert the whole numbers or mixed numbers to improper fractions. So in this first example, when I have 3/4 divided by 1/4, they're both already fractions, so I don't have to deal with anything. So step 2 is to find the reciprocal of the divisor. Okay, and reciprocal's in caps because that's the important piece. And the divisor's the second number. Okay, so when I find the reciprocal of the fraction, I take my fraction and I flip it. It's the thing that I can multiply this fraction by to get 1 is really where we come up with this. So I flipped the second fraction. So step 3 was I replaced the division symbol with multiplication. So now I'm not dividing anymore, I'm multiplying. So now step 4 is I go ahead and I multiply my fractions across, just like I did any other fraction. I multiply my numerator and I multiply my denominator. And then step number 5 is to simplify. Well, here I see 12 is divisible evenly by 4 to get a total of 3. So I'm going to follow those same steps, even if I start with the whole number divided by a fraction. I convert my whole number to an improper fraction. I find the reciprocal of the second one. I turn it into a multiplication problem. Then I go ahead and I multiply, and I simplify. I follow those same steps if I have a fraction divided by a whole number. I take my whole number and I convert it into a fraction. I find the reciprocal of my divisor, my second one. I turn it into a multiplication problem. I then multiply across, and I simplify if needed. Okay, so now we have this little just cheat sheet that folds nicely into your notebook. Okay, so the big key question I want you to think about right now is, why do we have to find the reciprocal? What does the reciprocal actually do, and why is that useful? So I'm going to kind of leave you thinking about that question, and I want you to be able to answer that if I ask it to you. Okay, so now we've looked at kind of everything to do with fractions. We've added, subtracted, multiplied, divide. Now it's time to work on some of those practice problems to actually put this stuff into motion. And as always, please let me know whenever you get stuck or have any questions.